Welcome to MT Mindfulness podcast. My name is Bob Chiang, and today I have Nick Spyker, mindfulness teacher and musician. He specializes in helping people who've had hallucinogenic and difficult drug experiences that sticks around. He runs a recording studio and is also an audio engineer. So welcome, Nick.
Thank you. Thanks for having me, Bob.
That's right. So Nick, just tell me, how did your journey in mindfulness begin?
Yeah, so I think the very first time I ever experienced any sort of mindfulness at all was during a guided, it was for cross country. We had one of our cross country runners, he was Bolivian, he was from Bolivia, and his mom taught yoga. And so she had us do a sort of visualization of a race where all of us laid down in the dark and would visualize, winning the race or doing something extraordinary during the race, doing well. And I remember falling asleep the first time, but a few times after that, I started to get a pretty significant experience of, I guess I would call it rest or relaxation. Okay. But I would say that was the very first time ever. And it wasn't until a lot later in college where I first started to meditate, first started to sit. And that was through a temple in Columbus, Ohio, a Karma Kaju temple. And for that, I would just go on Sundays. They had I think it was a 45-minute meditation session. And it was following the breath. And everyone would sit in silence. And then sometimes they would do walking meditation as well. But yeah, what got me into it, I guess, was that also trying to achieve or recreate experiences that I had experienced, meditation-like experiences on hallucinogenic drugs. That's really what got me into Karma Kaju to begin with. But yeah, the first time ever was the yoga, the laying down yoga.
And so what? I mean, you said going to the temple. That's quite a dedication to be able to do that. I mean, what spurred you to keep going?
Yeah, so when I was 17 years old, I took a drug called 4-MeO-PCP. I didn't know that's what it was at the time. It showed up on a drug test. At the time, I thought it was LSD. We had been taking it like once or twice a week, sometimes before band practice. But it was getting like weaker and weaker. Like every time we took it, we were getting less effects from it. And one day it stopped working altogether. So one of my friends, Jordan, and I took way too much. We put it on a piece of bread and took way too much. And I subsequently had, I think, what you would call a drug-induced psychosis and spent probably 3 or 4 weeks in the hospital and took over a year to recover from that experience. But during that experience, I had things occur that I would have later on meditation retreats. Just to name a few of them, one was having lucid dreaming. So having such an experience of lucid dreaming that I found it hard to differentiate between the dream state and the wakeful state. Experiences of halos, so experiencing people as having an energy field or a halo around them that's experienced visually.
Yeah.
And also experiences of everything being okay. Definite dissolution experiences. And I would say, when I say dissolution, I mean a loss of the felt experience that there's a self that exists. And I wasn't really ready for the experience. I would say in the Shinzen world, we talk about equanimity, which is the ability to allow things to come and go, whether it's visual stimuli, physical stimuli, sensations, whatever you want to call it. I would say that experience I was dealing with a very poor level of equanimity, to the point where it was causing significant problems. So at that time, I was given antipsychotic drugs, things like that, which ultimately did stop the experience. But after that, there was sort of a natural tendency to look towards the meditation. So that's what got me going to the temple. It was sort of trying to recreate or understand what had happened during the psychosis.
And did it help you in terms of your road to recovery, going to the temple and looking into
So it was
mindfulness?
I would say it was a good 2 years before I ended up in the temple. But yeah, I was still experiencing negative experiences at that time, negative side effects from it. And
Yeah.
actually, even my family, friends, people, even to this day, say that I am completely not the same person after that experience. I had abnormal brain scans. Like, there was significant consequences, because that drug in particular, which even today people sell under the pseudonym or false deceptive name of LSD, it has a really long half-life. So unlike LSD, it can stay in your system for a long time, and it actually has upper limits that are dangerous. You can take too much, and it has physical consequences, not just with LSD. There you can take too much, sure, but there's generally not going to be consequences that are long lasting, even on massive doses. There's a lot of data that shows that people have taken massive doses, ended up being okay, and even having positive consequences. But with this particular drug, there is upper limits, and they can be pretty negative. But yeah, I would say that the meditation helped significantly. So it was focusing on the breath, and I found it extremely difficult. And actually, I was kind of kidding myself when I was first doing it, thinking that I was holding the breath. Like, oh yeah, I made it the 45 minutes, focusing on the breath the whole time. But there was sort of a self-deception going on there, where I was not doing that. It took some time to recognize that I actually was distracted for periods of time during the meditation. And yeah, ultimately, the reason I got out of that practice in particular was some of the meditations they taught us afterwards were very, at least to me at the time, appeared very religious, focusing on certain entities, deities, kind of stacked up on your head, or imagining yourself as being a deity or an entity. And it started to get to the point where, at the time anyways, it started to rub me the wrong way. I grew up in a very, not going to say anti-religious, but we'll just say non-religious kind of household, and I was extremely skeptical of religion in general.
Yeah.
And so ultimately, that's what led me out of that realm, and into some somewhat more secular, I guess you could say, versions of mindfulness that focus more on the technique itself.
And what kind of, what were the windings that eventually took you to Shinzen's teachings?
Yeah, so I started to practice a lot more consistently after the experience at the temple, focusing on the breath. And then I eventually found TMI, so the Mind Illuminated, when it was pretty in its earlier state of
Yeah.
construction, which I really appreciated the detail that was being described. I remember the day that I decided not to go to the temple anymore, and someone had asked a question, and it was something like, I'm getting images or some sort of visual display, while my eyes are closed. What do I do with that? And the abbot answered in a way that I just felt was so utterly kind of just totally disregarding the whole visual realm as being insignificant. And that's when I decided I wanted a little bit more detail of what's happening and what the goal of the practice was. And I really appreciated the Mind Illuminated because of that. It had descriptions that were more complete, and it also had the stages lined out, like these different levels, which really appealed to me. Kind of, there's this first stage, there's this next stage. So yeah, I eventually got into TMI after that.
And what did you get out of TMI in terms of the practice?
Yeah, I found that it was able to increase my concentration significantly. And the main reason was because they give an instruction early on where you focus not only on the breath itself, so
Mhm.
not only contact with the felt sensation of the breath, but also allowing in other stimuli. So sort of spreading out the awareness. You're still focusing on the breath. In UM, maybe we would call it zooming out and zooming in at the same time, or sort of just expanding the awareness. And they talk about that in Rinzai Zen too, not just focusing on the felt sensations, but also allowing everything else in to come and go, which is a pretty significant difference in terms of, at least in my experience, I was able to hold the object for a much longer period of time.
Yeah.
And it seemed to allow for deeper states to come into being.
So as you were describing that, Nick, in terms of you're focusing on the breath, is that correct?
Yeah.
And then you kind of zoom out or soften to cover. Trying to not to use a technical term, but what's coming to me is there this space, or is it something else?
So maybe it's okay to use a technical term, I guess, but
Yeah.
I think well, let me just use like an analogy. So for example, if the tip of your nose is a television that you're watching a movie on,
Yeah.
then everything else would be the room outside of the television, the noises outside of the television itself. Just sort of being aware of a wider perspective while
Yeah.
still maintaining attention on the object itself. So
Yeah.
sort of allowing the background to exist rather than ignoring it or trying to shrink it.
Okay.
And from a UM perspective, maybe we would say that there's a percentage of attention being put in the background. And from a TMI perspective, it talks about not being able to focus on, in the book, it talks about not being able to, like when you're holding two things simultaneously, what's really happening is you're bouncing between the two. So in a way, you can think of it like that. Maybe that's what's actually happening on a micro level is we're bouncing between the two.
Yeah.
You're focusing on the tip of the nose and the other things that come out so rapidly that you can't quite tell that that's what's happening. But in any case, it seems to allow, in my experience, for a much easier to focus on the object itself. So a sort of concentration experience opens up much
Yeah.
faster for me, anyways. Especially in those early days, it was kind of a big deal being able to do that. And one thing that helped a lot, which I got from Loch Kelly. Loch Kelly, he has some books that I would say, are related to Mahamudra practice in the Tibetan tradition, or pointing out exercises, but using an eyes open. And Unified Mindfulness talks about eyes open practice, but with eyes open, you can really let in the environment, open up the peripheral vision while still maintaining your attention on an object. And it creates a distinctly different experience. So the concentration aspect, the ability to focus on something becomes a little bit easier in my experience when that's done. For example, I have a very hard time focusing on the tip of the nose for, say, an hour without eyes open. So it allows the environment in, the visual aspects of the environment in a way that is makes it easier to focus on an object.
Yeah. Um, just going back to the TMI experience, I did have a question that came up in my head. When
Mhm.
you were practicing at the time, did was your experience? Did you touch upon the spaciousness, or because from your description, that seems to be happening, but I just wanted to just check.
Yeah, so they go through the jhanas and the system itself, and I don't think I really got into the immaterial jhanas, but maybe the first four jhanas I touched on in TMI. So I would call it spaciousness because I'm opening up to the room around me, the world around me, while focusing on the object itself, which from a Shinzen perspective would be including the aspect of space. Now things get kind of confusing because when we're talking about space and UM, it's often we're practicing space. There's nothing else there. But this is more of an algorithmic thing. You're sort of including space into the practice itself, whatever object you're focusing on. And even in the Rinzai Zen stuff, it's the same thing. It's pretty clear. And some of these instructions were very old. They were translated from, hundreds of years ago.
Mhm.
It's clear that it's not a one-pointed concentration. We're not blocking out everything. There's sort of a global awareness happening. We're focusing on things outside of the object itself. So yeah, I would say spaciousness is included in that, but there's also that's the technique of spaciousness. But I would say also when you say the word spaciousness, and this might not be a UM official definition, but there's also the experience of spaciousness that can occur in any mindfulness practice where suddenly things with eyes closed or eyes open appear to be open and boundless and that sort of thing, which I think is distinctly different than the technique itself. So
Yeah,
uh,
the
allowing
experience.
this, the experience different than the technique, and I think that um, wasn't occurring for me so much on TMI, but did occur later, later on. But
Yeah.
having the spaciousness aspect available with the technique itself seems helpful, and I think it's worth trying out if you've been doing shamatha or one-pointed practice of some sort, trying to allow in the room or your environment, whether it's eyes open or eyes closed. And if it's eyes closed, you can kind of use your imagination of where you are. There's always kind of a spatial. We always kind of know where we are. So if you're in a room, just kind of imagining what's happening around you, or looking, opening your eyes, defocusing your gaze, and just kind of allowing the room in to the experience itself.
Yeah. Now, you mentioned about the jhanas, and you said with TMI you got to the fourth jhana. Just for those listening, could you just give a bit more details of what you mean um, uh, by the four jhanas and what those are like?
Yeah, so I would say there's two varieties of jhanas. One's kind of some people call Tranquil jhanas, and the others are more concentration jhanas. And so the concentration jhanas, I think some of the best resources for that are Leigh Brassington's resources. He has a book called Right Concentration, but it's essentially focusing on an object, particularly something that feels good. Some people use their hands, some people use their breath. I even heard about people getting into it through sound, like the sound of rain. But the jhanas are particularly pleasant. Shinzen talks about feed forward mechanism, where it's like something you're focusing on something, it feels good. You focus on that pleasant sensation, it continues to feel good, and then it snowballs into a sort of aggregation of something that becomes easier to like suddenly it's very easy to focus on. It's like the mind just sort of naturally gravitates towards the object itself. Um, the concentration jhanas, that it's sort of like efforting your way into them. At least that's the way it feels like to me. I practiced Leigh Brassington's book on a retreat, at the Black Diamond Retreat Center in Arizona with Tucker was there. He was the teacher there. And I found them to be pretty difficult. I had a lot of kriyas, a lot of movement, shaking, because I would say that is one-pointed, and I was using my hands, focusing on the pleasant aspect of my hands. And it was easy to fall out of them. Like, for example, sound could interrupt the experience itself in such a way that you drop out of it, like you fall out of it. But yeah, just to give like a definition, some people talk about it like they arise naturally when the hindrances fall away. But I feel like even if hindrances are present, it's possible to get into these concentration jhanas. They feel really good. It's something that's definitely worth looking into. And then there's another category of jhanas that David Johnson, Delson Armstrong, Bhante Vimalaramsi, out of the most of my experience comes from their center, which are a little bit different. I would call those the Tranquil jhanas. They're a little easier to get into, a little more natural to get into. Still feel really good, but just pointing out that there's two distinct versions. And in unified mindfulness, I wouldn't say that they don't exist in UM. I would say they occur in UM, but it's more just a random occurrence. Like they can arise during any technique, particularly during feel good or feel rest. But I would say there are techniques that lead you directly to them. And UM, it's more sort of random whether they arise or not. But I like that definition that Shinzen gives of the feed-forward mechanism. It's sort of like a self-consuming loop that occurs.
Like a positive feedback loop.
Positive feedback loop. There you go. Yeah. As things snowball, they sort of grow just because it feels good. It's natural to go towards that positive feeling and to focus on that positive feeling so that it just starts to aggregate and get bigger and bigger and bigger. But they're talked about in the original Sutas, and there's sort of controversy around whether the Mahasi Sayadaw type practice, which for any Shinzenites listening would be essentially see, hear, feel. Although they do some shamatha aspects in the Mahasi Sayadaw system, focusing on the breath and things like that, body scanning, whether the Mahasi Sayadaw can even lead to the ultimate goal, which in Theravadan Buddhism is called Nibbana or Nirvana. But yeah, from a jhana perspective, I would just say it exists. It happens in unified mindfulness practice, but there is clear instructions you can take and do to get there through other ways using other practices.
So when you're doing TMI, you said you got to the fourth jhana. So what are the four in terms of TMI?
So the first jhana is just an arising of piti. So piti isn't often talked about in the Shinzen's system, but you're focusing on the pleasant aspects of the hands or the breath. I would even sometimes use the sternum, but you're focusing on it so much that it starts to feel good, and it starts to spread around the body. I'm trying to remember what, but yeah, it starts to spread across the whole body. And it can be a little overwhelming to the point where you'll see people shaking, you'll see people, and I should also point out that in most jhana instructions, smiling is an important part of the instructions. And even in Right Concentration, Leigh Brassington's book, he talks about the smiling Buddhas statues in India as being a practice instruction, not not just there for any other reason. It's literally a practice instruction, having that smile. Because smiling works both ways. where you can laugh and smile, but also if you just apply a smile, no matter what mood or what state you're in, it's more likely for a pleasant state to arise.
Mhm.
But they talk about one-pointedness, rapture, happiness. To me, it feels like a vibratory flow state that sort of arises and is very easy to focus on once it arises. Once it arises, there's not much effort required to focus on it. Okay, and the second jhana is more focusing rather on the sensation itself, focusing on the happiness itself. So some people describe the second jhana as there being an absence of thought. In the tranquil jhanas, they don't think that's the case. So up at the Twin Center, the Dhammasukha Center in Missouri, they don't consider that to be the case. In my experience, I found sometimes that's the case, that when you've abandoned thought because you're focusing so much on this happiness itself, that sometimes the thoughts do naturally just kind of go away. But just like they talk about in UM, it's like ringing a bell. Even the happiness itself arising in this second jhana, sometimes it's really, really strong, but sometimes it's dissipating, it's going kind of away, and it requires a sort of reinvigoration of energy or effort in order for it to arise again.
Yeah.
And so the third jhana, things kind of settle down significantly to the point where I think in the suttas they call it rapture, but it's like a subtle form of happiness. There's sort of a calm that arises, and the attention itself moves from the happiness to this sort of calm, all-pervading rapture that occurs. And in the fourth jhana, it's really, really calm because some people call it the equanimity jhana. And I actually had oops, sorry, my mic fell. Sorry, my cat's getting in my face here. I had a conversation with Shinzen about this because in Unified Mindfulness, we talk about equanimity as a skill. It's something that's developed over time. But in the suttas and in a lot of Theravadan, a lot of Buddhism, equanimity is considered a state. It's the fourth jhana. But the mind becomes profoundly still. And the stillness is where the attention is moved from. So the happiness is gone. But it's important to note that it's not like a lesser state than the third jhana or second jhana or first jhana. The happiness and rapture itself is abandoned for this all-pervading equanimity. Things are calm in such a way that even happiness itself is a interruption to that one-pointedness on the equanimity itself. So it's like a pervading calm. And I would say that is the state that I got to in utilizing the TMI practice. But it's also important to note that the other jhanas are included in TMI. I don't know why I wasn't able to access them through the practice TMI itself. But in any case, the fourth one is where I kind of got to. Sometimes it's unclear what jhana you're in. Like you might have a lot of happiness, a bunch of equanimity come up, and then the equanimity fades and there's a lot of happiness, and it can be kind of unclear. And I don't think it matters so much about trying to figure out what state you're in, because if you're trying to figure out what state you're in, by definition, you've lost it. It might dissipate altogether, or maybe it'll dissipate and then kind of coagulate into whatever state or jhana you're in. So trying to figure out what one you're in isn't super, super helpful. Maybe afterwards it could be helpful, but it's not that helpful during the experience itself. But I got a ton of movement during the first jhana in TMI, and it was sort of super exciting. I would reach this state where all this pity, which is essentially joy, or we might call it vibratory flow, and
Yeah.
unified mindfulness, a sort of pulsing of energy pervading the body to such an extent that I was like rotating around my spinal axis. And I had got that a lot, at UM, but not to this like crazy level that I was getting with TMI. It was like the body was resisting what was happening, like it didn't want what was happening to occur. But it's a really powerful program, and I would say that the philosophical or whatever, the words that are used in that book, it really does work. It creates a sort of logical framework that you can follow that is helpful and useful. I will say it's profoundly slow, at least in my experience. I spent years and years practicing it, and I didn't seem to make a significant amount of progress in that time. Definitely more progress than I did at the temple.
Yeah.
So yeah, those are the 4 jhanas. I hope I answered that
Yeah.
well
Thanks.
enough. I mean, it's pretty brief there, but
Yeah. And how does that compare to your experience in Japan? Was it Rinzai Zen you decide to do
yeah, I did the
a boot camp?
Rinzai Zen retreat there. The temple was called Hozenji. It was west of Kyoto, and funnily enough, it was a beginner's retreat.
Okay.
So what that means is they weren't doing sesshin. Sesshin is I don't know what the word means exactly, but it basically means we're meditating now. We're not doing as much work or much other things. But yeah, the technique was interesting because they gave us handouts. I couldn't speak Japanese, obviously, but the handouts were specifically in Japanese, but I used a translation device called Google Lens. And also my
Okay.
wife is Japanese,
Yeah.
and she was there, so she was able to help translate some of these. But the instructions included a pretty, what I would call yogic breathing. And the instructions was to focus on the nose, doing this yogic breathing. And the first day that I was doing that, I actually got chastised many times because you're supposed to be completely silent in the Zendo, like to the
Yeah.
point where, I mean, if you make some noise, they're going to say something, which is embarrassing, especially being the only white person there. I don't want to be the person who was, causing problems for everyone. But
Yeah.
yeah, there was a pretty deep breathing where you inhale into the belly and then slowly exhale.
Yeah.
And then allowing everything in. So it wasn't just a one-pointed focusing on the nose. It had a similar instruction to TMI. At least that's how I kind of perceived it. I had seen it before. So I kind of took it to mean, the translations aren't perfect, but to focus on the nose, let everything else in, and do this breathing. But they did say that, because we did have some interviews that which I had Mio translate for. They did have some instruction and some interviews, and in one interview he was saying, "You're focusing way too much on this, man. Like most people don't get this breathing down right away." And I was just
Wow.
like, "Well, you gave me this paper, and the paper says to do it. That's why I'm doing it." But apparently, it's kind of slow. It takes time to work your way into it. And I also think I was kind of doing a more advanced, breathing out for too long
Okay.
sort of thing, whereas most people probably start a little slower. But it did bring a change in consciousness. This is very interesting. Um, so yeah, the technique there was very cool.
So were you breathing quite loudly because you said you were chastised?
So yeah, if when you do the in breath, it's rather quick, like a second or something, or 2 seconds, kind of just like expanding the belly, bringing the air in. But then on the way out, it's kind of hard to make zero noise when you're breathing out
Yeah.
for an extended period of time, because you have to kind of close the back of your throat, because if you let all the air out at once, you're not going to be able to do a 10, 20, 30-second out breath. So yeah, I would have like a little hiss or something, and then they would yell in Japanese. And I don't know what they were saying, but it would basically be, shut up. We're supposed to be quiet in the Zendo. But yeah, I found the whole experience to be profoundly painful. Just the way we were sitting. It was half lotus during the sits. And I would say there was only about 4 hours of sitting per day. But there was a lot of time spent working. And the most painful times was the meal time. Because you would have to sit in seiza, which for anyone who doesn't know, that's basically the heels are under your butt, so you're sitting with your knees to the ground, the heels under your butt, which isn't that hard for me to do for a couple minutes. But for the meal, sometimes it would be 20, 40 minutes, even more. And you're on the bamboo or whatever, tatami, I think it's bamboo floor. It's pretty hard. It's not as hard as concrete, but it's not soft. But a lot of people, would get up. Right when you get up, they ring the bell really fast, and you basically have to jog out of the room. Okay. And people would be falling over. Yeah. Like that. That's how, how asleep everyone's legs were. So I found that to be the most painful. It required a lot of attention on the space around me and averting the attention to the food and away from my ankles to deal with that.
Could you adjust yourself to sit in a different position?
No, okay. You couldn't adjust yourself at all. Okay. That was pretty. Yeah, they That's also did that. Okay. Yeah, they had a chanting thing in the morning where you'd chant for. And this was only about 20 minutes, 15 minutes less than the mealtime, but I would still get a lot of pain. And I was putting my ankles, like they had pillows for that. So you put your knees on the pillow. No pillows during mealtime, but for that you would put your I would put my ankles on the pillow and let my feet go off of the pillow, because it was like it gave me like a couple inches of. It was more comfortable, but I got away with it for one day, and then they saw what was happening and they made me stop doing it. So even like something as simple as that. Was not allowed. And I was so surprised when I found out that this place was not a they said it's not a real temple, which basically means it's for beginners. And so oh man, God help anyone who
it sounds hardcore. So how many days do you do it?
So I did it for 10 days. I was supposed to do it longer, but someone actually got COVID. Okay. Which they actually take extremely seriously. Still to this day in Japan, and they shut down the thing. And a lot of people did stay in their own cabins practicing. But since I was in Japan, I went off to, I can't remember the closest, there's Kyoto there, but I even went somewhere else. I went to, I took a train to another city. I wanted to explore. I didn't want to just sit in the cabin. So I went out and did some exploring during those days.
And were there any insights you gained from doing that Rinzai Zen experience?
Yeah, I would say it kind of helped with equanimity, like the ability to deal with pain and sensation, and also just the understanding that, how lazy I am. Oh my God. I mean, the amount of work we did there was pretty extraordinary, I would say. And a lot of it was, we were picking up leaves in the woods. It seemed kind of pointless to me, especially the first couple days. But I got a pretty extraordinary feeling of well-being and happiness. So just this acknowledgement that, if you are able to focus on what you're doing, things are going to go a lot easier. I mean, even the extreme pain during mealtime, I started to get used to it. Just used to being in pain. And I started to get feelings of well-being while being in pain, which is, it seems counterintuitive, but if you're bringing a state of concentration, equanimity, clarity to pain, it doesn't have to be that bad.
Yeah.
And there was like this momentum that both my wife and I experienced after the retreat, where we went back to her parents' house. They're getting older, and their house isn't as clean as a typical Japanese house because her mom's pretty sick right now. But we got back to her parents' house after this retreat, and we're just cleaning the shit out of everything. I mean, so there was sort of like a momentum that occurred where it's like we got in the habit of cleaning things to where it felt strange to not be cleaning things.
Yeah.
So it also sort of pointed to this like, wow, there's a really, like, you can make habits really quickly and maintain them really quickly, and you can make bad habits really quickly and maintain them really quickly. And how important the environment is, like the environment you put yourself in. I mean, if your room is extremely dirty, it has a impact on your consciousness, whether
Yeah.
it's subtle or unconscious. You might not realize what's happening, but things were so pristine there that even the first day we got there, it was difficult not to feel okay. I mean, because like everything you look at is in order from a physical, materialistic perspective. And I think that carries into the mind in a way. You know, like if your room's messy and the bed's messy and everything's falling to pieces, sure, you can have an equanimous mindset or be in a meditative state during any experience, but that really carried over. And maybe that's a cultural aspect rather than a meditative aspect. But yeah, it was pretty encouraging. You know, I remember getting home and cleaning all my stuff. And we signed up for another retreat in America, actually, at Daishuin West, which is I've not been there, but it's in California. And it sounds like they maintain a lot of the old ways, so it should be relatively similar
Yeah.
to the Rinzai that we did in Japan. And for that, we're doing an actual sesshin, which
Okay.
means there'll be less work and more sitting, for better or worse.
And when are you doing that, Nick?
That's in November, so
Okay.
mid-November. And yeah, one thing I liked about it is they use these wood blocks. Like they hit these wood blocks together to signal the end of the meditation. And it's like insanely ear-piercing. And it creates this momentary awareness, right? So instead of a bell, it's like this momentary awareness. But it was very boot camp-like in the sense that, and by momentary awareness, I mean like if someone like jumps out and scares you behind a trash can in an alley, it's a prank, you are awake in that moment. There's a sudden, aha, here it is. But they provide that opportunity all day long
Yeah.
by creating this sudden block slamming. And then right after that, you got to get your ass up and you got to run to the next thing. So there's a lot of jogging between stuff, you know, which that is very boot camp. Like I was in the military, so I understand what that's like, moving quickly from thing to thing. They would call it hurry up and wait, where you would run somewhere and then sit for an extended period of time while they figured out what you were going to do. But yeah, it was a great experience at the Zen temple. And most of the reason why I went is because Shinzen talking about his experiences with Rinzai Zen. So I wanted to check it out.
Did they use the stick?
They did use the stick. Yeah, they used the stick in the mornings, and he also used the stick at mealtime. And I don't think it's a common thing, but I think they were doing it because there was a lot of individuals there who were struggling so bad with the seiza. That there were because at this temple, a lot of people come who've never been to a temple, like a lot of Japanese people. So there was a lot of younger people who were struggling with the sitting. And at one particular mealtime, he was yelling just incessantly in Japanese at these kids who had just showed up. And I remember I remember asking my wife about it that night. What was he yelling? And she said he was yelling names. He was actually like calling names. Like one guy had a mustache. He was calling him Eel Mustache. And so he was like trying to get a rise out of them. And he was also, and this is the abbot, you know, whatever it's called, the Roshi of the temple. But he was also saying, like, if you want to leave, just go. You don't have to be here, you know, because there's people crying, you know, it hurts. So I found that to be extremely atypical and maybe of a American meditation retreat. But basically, there were some significant boot camp-like aspects. But if there's anything I've learned, you can get used to something very quickly as a human. So it's like it's like a training environment. It's very interesting, worth checking out. I would say make sure your ankles are nice and flexy before you go. Do some try to get in a half lotus for an hour or something. Practice your seiza, but it's definitely worth looking into.
Okay. Well, Nick, we're just coming to the end of the podcast, but I'd like to invite you again to come on and talk about your experience with hallucinogens and how that kind of maps to, practice and the states in meditation and mindfulness. So, would that be
Sounds
okay?
great.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Okay.
totally fine. And thank you so much for having me, Bob. Yeah,
Okay.
sorry we didn't get into that stuff, but that is a whole huge thing. Yeah, maybe we could talk about the psychosis and the how the hallucinogens relate to that and how they relate to practice, which I think they do in many
Yeah.
ways.
And also, I think what would be very valuable is, how you've managed to kind of recover and, used whatever techniques or other things that you found helpful to kind of integrate yourself more whole.
Absolutely. Yeah, we could
Okay.
talk about that for sure. Thanks for having me, Bob.
Okay. Thank you.